So 2030 is the target year that the UN has set for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. So that is the aim. So there's been a really long process for this. I remember starting working on this about 4 years ago, and we had this process called the world we want. The world we want by the year 2030. So in fact, this whole thing of the 2030 agenda is a visioning exercise to look into the future and see how we would like the world to be. So it's a very positive kind of an agenda. It's not like a SWOT analysis where you look at the bad things. It's what do we want? What kind of place do we want? What kind of people do we want? And so that's how the 2030 agenda has been framed. So who's heard of the MDGs? Yes. Now, how many MDGs were there? 8. Now, do you know how the MDGs came about?
It's a agenda where around 2000 or 2001 they identified 8 goals where this is important for humanity, like for example reducing poverty and increasing the mental health for women and also ensuring sustainable development for countries. And this one is like continuation of the MDGs, right? If I'm correct.
Absolutely correct. So the MDGs were 8 goals, and again, it was a 15-year agenda. So at the turn of the millennium, which is why they were called the Millennium Development Goals, those goals were adopted for a period of 15 years, and they were focused on only 8 things. 8 things that were considered to underpin many other things. So the SDGs is a little bit different because it's actually got a lot bigger. You know how many SDGs there are, right? 17. So why is this an important agenda for young people? And I think you probably know some of this too. 60% of the world's youth live in Asia Pacific. That's an enormous number of young people just on its own. The Asia Pacific has a number of very specific challenges that not everywhere else in the world has because of this. So we have the biggest employment gap between adults and youth. We have, not surprisingly, the largest number of young people living in poverty, simply because of the number of young people in the region. We have an enormous amount of people on the move in Asia Pacific, and you would know in your own countries that there is a lot of migrant workers, there's a lot of refugees, there's even probably a lot of you who go overseas to study and other things like that. So it's a really mobile group. But we also have a lot of children who aren't in school yet in this region, including in Southeast Asian countries. Now these are kids, some kids that never go to school at all, but there are also some kids who start leaving school after year 5, year 6, or after about the age of 14, when there becomes a much bigger cohort where there's no school places for them. And then we have this growing disparity in incomes, which is very obvious in Southeast Asian countries. And another thing that UNESCO has been working on recently, particularly in this region, is looking at bullying in schools and looking at some of the specific issues that young people are facing. And are you quite surprised at those figures? And it's boys and girls being bullied. And it's girls and boys doing the bullying. Yeah? So this is a really important agenda for young people because it's a big population and because there's all these really specific issues that young people face, and they face them in a different way. So, for example, if you look at something like the employment gap, young people don't have the same opportunities as adults. So when you're actually looking at how can you improve employment for young people, you aren't necessarily going to do the same things that you would do for adults. Okay, so these are the 17 goals. Now this is an awful lot to go through, so I decided that we need a simpler way to address the SDGs. And what we've just done in the UN here is we've just released this report And I've brought a couple of copies to leave with you here. So this report is going to be launched later this month here in Bangkok. And this report actually looks specifically at youth and the SDGs in Asia and the Pacific. It does have some sub-regional breakdowns for Southeast Asia and some other regions, but we have a particular problem with youth. Can anybody guess why it's difficult to write a report on youth?
We change trends. We change all the time, I think.
They change all the time because there's a transient thing. But data. You know, when you fill out things like the National Census form, it doesn't, when they put the statistics together, they don't actually tag youth as a subpopulation. So if you want to know how many young people live in poverty, the only way to do that is to say, well, we know that this many people earn below the poverty line, multiply it by the number of youth. We don't actually have a real figure. So, you know, this report is very interesting in that it tries for the first time to try to get statistics on all of these different things. We have lots of reports on different subjects, like the school bullying one, but this one is actually trying to pull together all of the different things we know about youth in relation to the SDGs. So what we did with this report, instead of having 17 chapters and one on each SDG, we used this simplified version of the SDGs, which is called the 5 Ps. So you can see from this: people, planet, prosperity, peace, and partnership. And this, I think, because the SDGs, you know, if you go out to a community and you wanted to talk to them about SDGs, and you want to say, goal number 1 and goal number 2, people would lose interest by goal number 3, really, right? But the 5 Ps, I think people can relate to this. It's simple, it kind of conveys the message. We want to look after all of these things, and we want to use partnerships to do it. So this report actually is revolving around the 5 Ps. So, but what I'm going to do is, I'm not going to use the 5 Ps because they overlap. Like, many Ps are relevant to more than one goal. So if you look at a goal, for example, like the one relating to cities and urban areas, of course that has environmental implications, which would be planet, because cities use a lot of energy, for example, a lot of electricity, they use a lot of water. But there's a lot of social issues in cities too, so it's a people thing. So these goals actually don't neatly fit under the 5 Ps, but they do cross over them. So I'm just going to quickly run through some of the key findings in the report in relation to the SDGs. I won't do each goal separately. Some of them I've joined them together because, for example, there's several environmental goals. So we don't have to stand here and go through 17 different ones. So in relation to goal 1, poverty obviously is really important for young people because it impacts on your future life opportunities. So the fact that so many young people are living in poverty is not simply about the poverty itself, it's about their whole future life and what they could have achieved and what maybe they can't achieve because of living in poverty. So it has this whole lifespan event, whether it's from the fact that a person living in poverty is not going to get a good education and can't compete for a good job, or because they're malnourished when they're a child or a teenager and they're going to have health issues for their whole life. So it really underpins the whole of life. There are really high rates of youth working poverty in South and Southeast Asia. So that means that even young people who get a job aren't earning above the poverty line. And that's happening in our communities in this region. Young women have significantly higher working poverty in this region. Now this particular is in South Asia, I have to say, but it's across the region. So, all of my slides are going to be not just about the statistics, but what can you do about poverty? Any ideas from you? What could you do to address some of these issues? I hear whispers. Okay, so wealth redistribution. But how do you as a young person make that happen? So, you know, the MDGs, I said before that the MDGs was it went on for more than 4 years in developing this through the process, The World We Want. Part of that process was a global survey called My World. Did any of you participate in the My World survey? Yes. And the My World enabled every single person in the world, no matter where you were, how old you were, to vote for what you wanted to be in the 2030 agenda. Now obviously you had to have the internet, which was a limitation, so probably less poor people voted, but we did do paper copies and things when we could to try to bring in other people. So, you know, the process for developing these goals is like the 2030 agenda itself. It's not just about governments and it's not just about the UN. It's about engaging everybody. So some of the things that you can do, how many of you know how much poverty there is in your country? This is something a lot of countries don't have good data on. As I mentioned, for the Asia-Pacific region as a whole, the only way that we could calculate poverty was to say there's X million youth, and we know there's 25% of the population living in poverty, therefore there's 25% times X million young people. Now we know that that's actually a strong estimate because we actually know, because youth earn less money and they're working poverty, that in fact it's probably more than that. But still, it's a very gross kind of an estimation. So finding out more about poverty, who's affected and why, is something that you could do. Because people don't know. If you don't know, it's hard to do something about it. Once you know, you can be an advocate. You can campaign against poverty. You can join anti-poverty initiatives that already exist. Now some of these are local, some of them are regional, and some of them can even be global campaigns. So the next goal, some of the statistics that we came up with. And this one was actually, again, fairly hard to get actual statistics. We don't know exactly how much poverty and food poverty is affecting the health of young people. What we do know is that malnutrition rates in children are very high in this region, and that malnutrition in childhood is already going to be leading to health problems in young people. Obviously, nutrition for young people, for youth, is still important, but it's not as important as when their bodies are growing so much. I think I already said that. So, and migration of youth to urban areas is reducing the potential of youth to be addressing food security. There's actually a lot of issues to do with food security in this region because if you look at the average age of farmers in Southeast Asian countries, how old do you think they might be? Pretty old. Most of them are over 50, many of them are over 60. And so that means that younger people are not entering the farming industry. And it's to do with many reasons. It's to do with economic reasons, because it's not very profitable. It's to do with social reasons. It's not very much fun to live in those areas. It's to do with education. People move away for other opportunities. But nearly every country in this region has an aging farming population, which means that what's going to happen to our food production in a few years when these people either retire, they might go out of business because of the economics. So, you know, we're becoming more and more dependent on imports. And although that gives us choice, it creates other issues, particularly in relation to economies. I can afford to buy imported chicken or imported mangoes or something like that. But a person who earns not very much money is going to find that very difficult as well, which means that their nutritional intake is also going to be affected. So again, what can you do? Any ideas what you could do in relation to this? This is a tough one. How do you make young people stay in farming securities, for example? Yeah? Any ideas? No?
one of the biggest problems that we have with food security is how much food we actually throw away. Some of the studies that have been done on this by the FAO shows that we could actually reduce our food production needs by something like 15% if we could just reduce food waste. How do we make agricultural jobs and rural lifestyles more appealing for young people? Well, again, think about where all the facilities are. Even where are all the good hospitals in your country? They're in the cities. So one of the things that we actually haven't focused on a lot with most national governments is building up rural infrastructure. So there are some things that can be done. Maybe young people can't do them themselves, but maybe they can be part of doing it. Oops, that one didn't last long. Oh well, we'll just go on to the next one. Okay, so health and well-being. So if you actually look at statistics for young people's health problems, because we don't know how malnutrition and some things are affecting them, the things that come up, alcohol use. Alcohol use is leading to an increased level of disability in our youth. Suicide. Have any of you seen youth suicide statistics for your country? Some countries in this region are very high, some of the highest in the world, and it's a leading cause of death. And the other leading cause of death for young people is traffic accidents. So these three areas are really key health issues for young people. Now, some of them, maternal mortality is also quite high in some countries too, and it varies. But in general, these are three of the key issues affecting young people in this region. But what can you do about it? Oh, there's more. Sorry, I put 4 in this one. Oh, a third of new HIV and AIDS infections are youth. And again, this is not surprising because this is the age when most people start dating and start that, side of life, getting married. So, but this is still quite a lot of young people. So, how do you respond? Raising awareness on alcohol and tobacco is something that young people tend to maybe not try to stop alcohol and tobacco because it's a fun thing. It's part of becoming a young adult. It's something new that you can do, and it's very much associated with partying, but it's also very much associated with some bad things too. Another thing, how many of you did sexuality education in school? Okay, so a few of you have done that now. So this is something that still doesn't exist in a lot of our schools. When we say comprehensive sexuality education, it's actually looking at the broader issues. It's not just looking at the biological side. It's looking at things like negotiation skills. A lot of young women have sex because of power relations with men. But if they learn how to speak about it, how to negotiate, then maybe they don't feel so compelled to do these kind of things. So when you're talking about this comprehensive approach to education, you're talking about relationships, you're talking about health, you're talking about mental health issues, you're talking about negotiation skills. That's something that we don't have in a lot of schools yet. And youth-friendly health and crisis services. Now these exist in some countries, but again, they're often quite limited in who can access them. I know my son's school has a really good service for this, but he goes to an international school, and that's not something that's available to people that can't afford that kind of an education. So how can we provide these kind of youth-friendly health and crisis services? You've probably, some of you heard of things like suicide hotlines. Yeah, and a lot of those suicide hotlines are managed or manned by people like you on the end of the phone, volunteers who are there to talk to people that have a problem. That's what makes them youth friendly, is when other youth volunteer to be part of the solution. You know, I did a youth suicide prevention project in Samoa once, and I did it through the Ministry of Youth, and I thought, well, there's a really high suicide rate in this country. It's really something that young people need to start talking about. I got the project report back from the government, and they said they held a youth camp, and they had half a day where they talked about youth suicide. And when I looked at what they talked about, the pastor who was leading the youth camp got up and told them that they wouldn't think of suicide if they prayed more. And I was incredibly down and disappointed, because these were young people who were engaged in the church and young people who already were praying. The fact that suicide was still occurring in this community was not related to how much they prayed. It was related to the issues in their lives. And I thought, well, he probably would have made me feel even more suicidal if I was one of these people, because I would have felt so frustrated. And he was like in his 60s, and he was very old-fashioned. And I think this is why youth-friendly crisis prevention services can be so needed, because who's more likely to relate to the problem that young people need to talk about? They might be embarrassed to talk about it with an older person. So youth-friendly services are not just something for governments, they're something for youth to be engaged in as well. Okay, our next goal, education. So one of the things about the MDGs is that some of the goals were almost achieved, or they were achieved in many countries. And one of the ones that was achieved in many countries was universal gross primary education. That means that every child was enrolled in primary school at some stage. Now, we still had some countries that didn't make that, and we still have some countries that don't have good data. Even with school enrolments, sometimes it's hard. Obviously, when you enroll in school, you fill out lots of paperwork, but the paperwork doesn't always make it through to the statistical collections. So we have done much better with primary education. We still have kids out of school, but we've done much better. But when we look at secondary education, you can see in some countries the enrolment is as low as 38%. That means more than half of young people aren't getting to secondary school in some countries. And in some countries, again, we're doing really well. And this obviously, you probably can think yourselves, the wealthier countries, countries like Thailand and Malaysia and Singapore and Brunei will be doing quite well here. And some of the countries that aren't doing very well are some of the poorer countries like Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Timor-Leste. Yeah? So this has a lot to do with the wealth of the country and the opportunities that are made available for secondary education. There's many reasons why education is important, and it's not just for jobs. Because what we actually find is fertility rates are strongly, it's not just fertility rates, it's like both the rates and the age at which women start childbearing. Uneducated girls are more likely to get married young, have children even as teenagers, and have more poverty and health issues with their children. So the whole future generation is actually affected by this lack of education because it's passed down through the family. So this is a really high correlation. So in the countries where the girls aren't going to school, we get big rate, other ongoing problems afterwards. So providing more placements for secondary education, well, this is probably not something that young people can do. Governments are the main provider of secondary education, but young people can advocate for this kind of thing. Alternative types of education. Now, anybody can get involved. Do you know how many NGOs there are in this Southeast Asia? There's thousands of them. And in some countries, and I haven't looked at every country, but in Cambodia I've been looking at, anyone from Cambodia? I've been looking at NGOs in Cambodia, and there's many of them, and probably half of them are involved in doing education. It's a really big number. Some of them are educating orphan children or street children or out of school children, some of them in rural areas, but there's a lot of community activity going on in terms of education. So some of them are providing basic primary education for kids that don't get any. Others are providing, you know, specialist areas like environmental education or something else like that. Targeted incentives to encourage girls and boys to stay in school. And again, even UNESCO sometimes has done this through the staff club by providing scholarships to low-income families, things like that, just from the staff raising contributions. I'll need to speed up a little bit or I'll run out of time. Now, this one in particular, gender equality, it's really one of the ones that I'm very passionate about. Rape is still common in our countries, and a lot of men have admitted to committing rape. Young women are often victims, but also through forced marriage and early marriage. And the largest number of girls married before the age of 18 are in South Asia. And that's actually important because it has many other health and other implications. It's not just about rights and things. So some of the things that can be done is include young men, young women and young LGBT in your activities. Provide support to victims of rape. And again, there's kind of youth-friendly crisis prevention services are the kind of things that could be there. And be an advocate against some of these things where they happen. So here I've got 3 goals that we can put together and look at some of the statistics. In many countries, youth don't have access to sanitation. Increasing wealth is associated with purchase of energy. So the more wealthy we are, the more energy we consume. The more electrical items we have, the more cars we have. And our consumption patterns actually make it so that instead of being sustainable, they become more unsustainable because we have the capacity to use more. So these ones are all about living in cities and consumption. So reduce water and energy consumption, everybody can do that. Keep items that are energy intensive for a longer time. One of the things, I bought a car when I came here, and I bought a 2-year-old car. I took it down to Honda here to service it, and they said, it's so old, why don't you buy a new one? Just get rid of this one. Okay? You know, you should keep these items. It's a perfectly good car. It's only done like 20,000 kilometres. And so his idea was that it was too old. It wasn't the latest model. Provide opportunities for youth as innovators. Now, a lot of the time, youth don't have access to being innovators because of the legal requirements, because of the financial requirements, all of those kind of things. But this is something that would help to get young people involved in these kind of things. Unemployment and work. Again, unemployment rates are 3 to 4 times higher than adults. There's a distinct shortage of good jobs. Sometimes there are jobs, but they're dirty jobs. They're dangerous jobs. They're not paying enough money for what they're doing. And a quarter of the world's international migrants are under 29. One of the reasons why migrants is really important is because most people migrate for jobs more than anything else. So, advocate for better working conditions, provide microfinance and programs for migrant youth. You know, local languages, how do you access things here? The laws in each country are different. It doesn't work the same. I come here from Australia, you know, it doesn't work the same. When I want to go to the doctor here even, it's kind of confusing because I took my son to the doctor and I took him to a child's doctor and they said, well, why did you come to the child's doctor? He has a broken toe. And she didn't even look at his toe. She just said, go and see the doctor that deals with bones. Well, I didn't know this because in Australia you're not allowed to do that. You have to go to a GP and get referred to the specialist doctor. Even little things like that. Okay, 30 million youth live in urban areas in Asia Pacific. And, you know, there are 30 megacities in the world. Asia Pacific has something, I can't remember, I think it's 9 of those are in Southeast Asia. You can think of them yourselves. And we also have a couple of other, I think 2 or 3 cities that are approaching megacity size. I know one is Ho Chi Minh, Hanoi, and I think KL is the other one. So they're not megacities yet. Thailand has Bangkok, Jakarta, and Manila are megacities, but we have other ones that are approaching megacity status quite rapidly. Purchasing power of youth. Did you know you had this much money? Youth in Asia Pacific have a lot of money. So, but it's not equally distributed, obviously. Low awareness of unsustainable consumption. Most people aren't thinking about how much they're consuming. Safe spaces for urban youth is a problem because of city safety is an issue. Changing behaviour is difficult as you get older, and reduce, reuse, recycle. I'm sure many of you have heard of that slogan before. Now these are all the environmental goals. Asia Pacific is at the highest risk from climate change and natural disasters of any region in the world. Young women spend more time collecting water in arid areas. So this is something that's getting worse. It means they're not in school, which is one of the reasons it's a problem. 17,000 young people drown every year in Bangladesh. So, you know, the environmental issues are there, but young people are not only victims, they're actors. And particularly for environment, I think this is an area where a lot of young people get involved in community groups that do things. Mitigate incidental impacts of climate change, and be involved in some kind of conservation group or something like that, and build youth capacity for disaster response. We work with a group called Youth Beyond Disasters. That's exactly what they do. They run workshops for youth to be responders to disasters in their own countries. Conflicts. Now we don't have hardly any good data on this. This figure of 60% of the world's conflicts is like 10 years out of date. And that's the best figure we have. We don't know how much youth are involved in conflict in this region. There's problems with democratic participation of youth because there are limits on how you can participate. A lot of people, you can't stand for office. Countries with, this is a statistic from global studies. They've noticed that a large youth population is correlated strongly with conflict. So where there are more young people, there is more conflict. Social protection is limited. That means, you know, like unemployment benefits, health benefits, and those kind of things. Particularly because youth are working in the informal sector. So raising awareness, exercising your rights, vote when you can, don't just not turn up. Provide specific youth justice services and advocate for social protection. Internet, you all probably have access to the internet. One of the things about this particular goal is it's thought that youth as like users on the internet are able to change things. How do you use your internet, youth? Are you doing internet shopping, or are you actually looking for causes and things like that? So we have a lot of youth organisations, we have a lot of internet users in this region. So how youth can actually be involved through youth groups, be involved in community groups, use the internet not just for shopping. And okay, so who's responsible for the agenda? Often we think of government, we think of intergovernmental organisations, we think of business, we think of the community. Anybody else involved in implementing the agenda? Individuals, exactly. Man, women, children, elderly, youth, disabled, everybody. This agenda was signed off by the governments, but it's meant to be an agenda for everybody. Everybody to have responsibility. Now these are most of the UN agencies that are here in this region. I think you probably recognise some and not others. I didn't even know what all of these were. There's actually more. So the UN is huge and the UN has all these bits. How many of these do you think work with youth? UNICEF does? Yep. In fact, if I were to circle all of the ones that work with youth, every single one of them has a youth program on their website. We know some of them better. UN Women, UNFPA does a lot of work on adolescent health. SCAP has a big youth program. UNEP has tons of youth. So these are some of the programs. UNESCO has a youth strategy with 3 parts: capacity development, civic engagement and policy. These are some of the things we have happening in this region. And these are some of the things that you can do. You can get involved in these programs. A lot of the youth programs are for and with youth. They're not just about targeting youth. They're about engaging with youth. And have any of you heard of the UN Major Group for Children and Youth? The UN set up a series of major groups for community input to the UN, and there is one of those groups called the UN Major Group on Children and Youth, and they specifically advocate at UN global meetings for youth's views. And any young person under the age of 30 can join. You can get as involved as you want, or a youth organisation can join. And they're quite active, particularly in things like this, setting the SDG agenda. They're active in things like the World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction last year in Sendai. They'll be currently working on UN Habitat, which is the urban settlements. Quality of urban settlements was just the next big global conference. So you just Google them, you can find them, you can just join by sending them an email, and they're one of the major mechanisms that we have. So we cannot always build the future for our youth, but we can build our youth for the future. And I like that phrase, and I think that Franklin Roosevelt was a very smart man when he said that. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Dr. Sue Vize for her interesting and engaging presentation. So I'm sure this has sparked some interesting thoughts and questions for you. So we're going to begin the Q&A session so that our selected reactors can...
Thank you for your lecture. My name is Yusuke Okubo. I'm from Japan. Last month, I attended the forum about SDMGs held in Kyoto City. The theme was that let's take action to achieve this goal from now. In fact, everyone can have jobs related to SDMGs. Once we started working for companies, it's not easy to think about SDMG is my issues and problems. So what can we do and what to do in order to accomplish it as a youth? Thank you.
Yeah, one at a
Okay.
time.
So the corporate sector is one area where the UN has traditionally had difficulty engaging. And one of the particular things that was done at the last Rio Earth Summit, are you aware of the Rio Global Earth Summit meetings? The last Rio meeting really tried to engage the corporate sector and business in particular. And so they were in fact part of setting this agenda. And you'll find quite a lot of the bigger companies have taken this kind of thing on board with their corporate social responsibility programs. But the UN did a study on this a couple of years ago, a global study, and it showed that corporate social responsibility has benefits to the company, has benefits in terms of the bottom line financially, it has terms of benefits in terms of staff satisfaction, health and various other things. So I think as a youth advocate, you should be encouraging the company that you work for to have a corporate social responsibility program. You can present them with a lot of information that says why it would be good for the company as well. I hope that is a good idea for you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vize, for your amazing presentation. For me, talking about SDGs always become excited because it's just like talking about a big ambition, and it's just like our dream together to achieve these goals. And I believe that all the people have to take their roles, including youth. What I want to share is something really a little bit sad of the condition of in Indonesia, that young people in Indonesia are not really aware about these global goals. Yeah, I just checked and asked for a few of my friends, my college friends, and they don't know about these goals. It's really sad. That's why now I and my friends are initiating a project called Indonesian Youth for SDGs. We are just like to mobilize young people to actively engage and participate to achieve this goal. So now I want to request for some advice from you for my project, because our first strategy is to raising awareness of youth about this 17 amazing goals. So, and the second one, we're gonna engage with young people, young organization, young youth organization to collaborate together. So, the first thing I just want to make clear what's exactly the role of youth. Are we only the supporter of the government, or we are the one who push the government to do this on this, or what is exactly our role? And the second one is, do you have any could you please share me a little bit about strategic way to approach with the UN agency about my projects, and maybe some like strategic thinking to do more engagement in practical way? And the last question, it's more personal. Do you think that after 2030 we're gonna have a new global agenda or something like that? Thank you so much.
You're getting your value for money out of the questions. So firstly, I think that it's not just the government as an actor, and I think maybe from my potential actions that I recommended that people could do, a lot of them were things that young people can do themselves. You don't need permission from anybody to do things like change your consumption habits. You know, you have a television in your family, right? Your family wants to upgrade the TV. Maybe you can encourage them to keep it for another year or two. That's actually saving the world a lot of energy. Or you can do something like be involved in one of these crisis prevention services, or you can be an advocate and you can push your government. As an individual, that's difficult, but exactly what you're doing through the youth group, you have strength if you join a group. You can do it locally through your group at the university, or you could do it globally through something like the UN MGCY, the Major Group on Children and Youth. So if it's difficult to do things in your country because for whatever reasons, for safety reasons, you can still be a global advocate and do these things in other ways. So that's two of your questions. In terms of approaching UN agencies, if you give me your email address, I can introduce you to somebody in the UN in Jakarta. They have an interagency group working on youth projects. I don't know what the other agencies are doing, but UNESCO has specifically been doing a project on youth and SDGs in Indonesia, particularly leading up to this process. Now, I know it's a huge country, so they obviously missed a lot of the several million young people, but they do have some ideas, and they are working with the Indonesian government on a lot of youth projects at the moment. And in terms of the future agenda, I think that there's every likelihood that in the year 2030 we won't have achieved all of these goals. I think some of them are too ambitious. I don't think we can achieve all of them. Whether or not people think this kind of approach is still going to be valid, I think that they probably will, but it possibly depends on the next 15 years. And particularly how, you know, the MDGs weren't very well known, particularly until the last couple of years, even in national governments. It was only really that kind of MDG reporting that was done at the end that really started to raise awareness. And as you say, the 17 goals are unknown and they're difficult to sell. You know, read these 17 goals and people aren't going to get to the end of the list. So use some things like the 5 Ps, you know, to introduce them to youth, to get engaged, or focus in on 1 or 2 areas that you can use. But again, there will be an agenda after this, but maybe somebody will come up with a new brilliant idea about doing it in a different way. I don't know what it will be. I'm not that close to these kind of things. Yeah.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Dr. Suwais, for your interesting presentation about the SDG goals. My name is Kenny. I'm from Malaysia. To speak on this, correct me if I'm wrong, like UNESCO and also this kind of SDG, although they are recognized and acknowledged by nation states around the world, but they're not really legally binding, right? Is that true?
They're not legally binding, but it's the countries that actually adopted these, not the UN. So they have a moral commitment rather than a legal commitment.
Yeah, that's where my question is. Like, for example, countries who involve in these kind of issues are countries which are like in poverty due to several factors, and one of them is like, for example, conflict itself in the country, civil wars, and most of them focuses on high politics and regime survival rather than this kind of goals as the interest for the country. So my question is, how can like UN or other nation states can work together like to pressure, because at the end of the day, one of the main stakeholders to clear and do all of these goals are the national government itself, where you can totally change the situation in the country. So if a national country refuses to do that, how can like UN and other member states can actually pressure them to do it? You know, if it's a moral commitment. Thank you.
So one of the things that the UN will do with this, as they did with the MDGs, is that every 5 years countries will be asked to report on how they're going. Now, my experience of when countries write reports is they tend to focus on the good, and they often don't put the bad in so much, and this happens with a lot of these things. But the reports will actually have to go through the UN and they'll have to be verified. And one of the things that was often used with the MDGs was traffic lights. Are you aware of the system of traffic lights? So you look at each goal and you score it as green, amber or red. Green if they're on track, amber if they're close or not too far away, and red if they're off track. And one of the things that happens with these is that then they're shared at intergovernmental meetings. So if Malaysia goes to an intergovernmental meeting and they have 10 green lights and 7 red lights, that's going to be an embarrassment to them. Say it's an ASEAN meeting or a SEAMEO meeting. Maybe they'll be talking about the education indicators. That puts pressure on Malaysia to change the status from red to green. And it's those kind of intergovernmental mechanisms and publicity about lack of performance that is the main mechanism to use to help to increase countries. UN, World Bank, donor countries, some of your countries are now donor countries, Malaysia is one, will also invest in projects to specifically address some things. Obviously they may not be addressing everything internal, but one of the things that is different about the 2030 agenda compared to the MDGs is that the MDGs were for developing countries. The SDGs are for every country. Every country, regardless of its status, is supposed to be trying, and I don't think there's a single country in the world that could claim to have achieved all of these goals. So whether it's the US or Australia or Malaysia or a poor country like Bangladesh, they've all committed morally to this.
Hi, my name is Chanmi. I'm from South Korea, and thank you for your presentation. I had a much clearer vision of SDGs right now, thanks to you. My question is actually related to your personal experience. I saw that you have like largely invested in the field of youth and education, but I found that before you joining UNESCO, you worked in like NGOs in different countries. So of course, your focus has been youth and education. How is that? How was different between working with NGOs to this issue, or what has been different between working with NGO and UNESCO, things like that, and then yeah, I want to hear about like how these kind of changes, how this kind of differences change your perspectives and your working style, and then like what kind of capacities do they have? Yeah.
Okay. So working with NGOs is very fulfilling because you can generally get quick and very visible results. So some of the things we used to do, for example, training people in Aboriginal communities to work, you could see they can get a job. They do the training, you help them get a job through the employment service, then you can see an immediate result. If that was to be done by the UN, we would be talking to the government about a policy and talking to the government about setting up their services, and it would take a really long time, and we would probably be targeting the policy level. And so then once the government makes the policy, then the government has to implement the policy. So a lot of the time with the UN, it's quite difficult because our input stops when the policy is done. But sometimes the government does or does not implement the policy. They don't necessarily have the capacity. And sometimes they might do a policy, but they don't really have the will to do much about the policy. So working with an NGO, you always get to follow through and get this kind of hands-on experience. But working with the national government, you're like 3 steps away from the things that are happening when you're working from the UN. They're not our programs, they're the government's programs, and we're providing things to help the government get it done. That being said, when you're working with an NGO, if you're doing a project, maybe you're going to affect 100 people, or a small community, or a small mangrove or beach area that you're going to clean up, or the rubbish tip or something. It's a small area. When you're working with national governments, if the policies are good and affect change, you can be affecting millions of people's lives. So there's differences in scale, there's differences in impact, and but it's a slower, much slower process with the UN. So that's some of the key differences.